Alright, so I really like movies. And I really like talking about movies. And since I have some time on my hands right now, I decided to make my first ever YouTube video, which, of course, talking about movies. And what better way to kick things off than to go through the stuff that disturbs and disgusts and shakes me to my very core. I've always been drawn to weird and unsettling stuff. I was one of those kids that snuck to the TV at night and watched the programs he wasn't supposed to watch. Being forbidden or naughty really has a magical magnetism for kids. And as I watched more and more movies, I found out that this is pretty much a universal phenomenon. People like watching stuff that upsets them. It has a cathartic quality. You get to vicariously live through a transformative experience from the comfort of your couch without actually suffering through most of the extreme consequences. It's essentially secondhand suffering. Now, what is actually disturbing to me? There's no one-size-fits-all stencil. That's why I made a list of examples of stuff that disturbed me at different levels. The idea is that I'll talk about a couple of examples that share similar themes, slowly working my way towards disturbing Mount Olympus. Also, I know that that's pretty much the format that Cinefix uses, but they don't own top 10 lists. Also, please, if you see this, do hire me. Before we start, let's talk for a second about the movies that have been curated as the most disturbing. The who is who of guts and shit and gore and necrophilia. Though I've sat through a lot of those too, these are not gonna be on this list. The point is that they are so over the top that it's really easy to disconnect and be aware that you're watching a movie. Gore and torture porn like Saw or Hostel or the infamous Cannibal Holocaust are just vehicles showcasing what special effects can do nowadays. Or the notoriously hard to watch movies like a Serbian film or Human Centipede, or this entire subgenre called New French Extremity. Though they vary widely in quality, they all have one thing in common. They're designed with a primary goal in mind to upset their audience, and that, at least for me, makes them feel very one-dimensional and dull. All these heinous acts that we get to watch are in theory repulsive and would scare you for life, but it's also so artificial and constructed that it's hard to let them get to you. Some guy on Reddit put together the disturbing movie iceberg, and while in theory you get more disturbing the deeper you go, the quality of the movie suffers exponentially. It's hard to go along with a movie if it's just designed as a dissonant orgy of nastiness. Once you reach a certain threshold, right about here, before we hit complete nonsense like Melancholie der Engel or Vomit Slaughter Dolls, it's just not worth watching anymore. At least not for me. I don't judge though. So for a movie to be able to really get to me, it needs to at least have a second level. A plot or a message or something that keeps you engaged while the disturbing stuff sneaks up from below and grips you. It's sort of like the equivalent of a jump scare. Yeah, it gets your heart racing for a second, but ultimately it's inconsequential and you forget about it the second that you leave the theater. So the best disturbing stuff, just like the best horror, needs to be situational and shake you at a more gut level. Losing your faith in humanity is a slow burn at the end of the day. I also want to briefly give some honorable mentions. I want to shout out to the movies that are disturbing or feature disturbing subject matter or images, but at the same time have some other redeeming qualities that elevate them. And let's be totally clear here, this is what I find rewarding, tastes differ widely on that. To borrow a phrase from John Waters, you can be lewd, crude, but you gotta be socially redeeming. You can already tell that the business of gross out movies is a tightrope walk. These are movies like Pink Flamingos, where the aforementioned veteran pope of trash, John Waters, disseminates what it actually means to have good taste versus bad taste. He lovingly pokes fun at the Americana of the 1950s and 60s, and at the same time he leads a rebellion against the squares that want to rain down on you and me who are just trying to have a good time. These are movies that manage to be aesthetically pleasing in the most disgusting ways ever. Movies like Salo or Taxidermia that, while presenting utterly revolting imagery, have a sense of beauty and poetry that moves you to your core. Taxidermia has horribly obese people puking into meat grinders and simultaneously investigates the evolution of Eastern European countries during the Cold War. Salo makes strong points about power, seduction and fascism, doing so in images I really don't want to recount here. It's repulsive and makes us take a step back, but upon closer inspection we find an inherent beauty in the carefully arranged shots and aesthetics and learn interesting points of view if we look a little bit closer. So to be truly disturbing, you have to walk the fine line between not being redeeming enough to overshadow the disgusting aspects, but at the same time you have to be more than a string of gross images or ideas. But that's not what you came for. You came, presumably, because you like being queasy in your seat. Here's the top 10 movies that I had to take a shower after watching. It's probably best to ease myself into this a little bit. So let's talk balls-to-the-wall body horror. Often the implications, be it to your psyche or to something deeper at a gut level, of what is shown in body horror is far worse than the graphic special effects hurled at you from the screen. Movies that definitely stuck with me are Tetsuo the Iron Man, an experimental Japanese movie about people fusing with metal scrap in a surreal semi-dream world culminating in a rotating metal penis. The stop-motion effects and the fast editing support, but don't outstage a general feeling of uneasiness that you're left with. Or more recent efforts like Swallow, about a young woman developing pica as a result of being caught in a loveless marriage. Or Titane, about a young woman getting impregnated by a car. But again, those elements are not center stage when watching. The body horror is just a thin veil lying on top of something that punches you in the stomach. But if you're talking body horror, you gotta talk all the 50 Shades of David Cronenberg. And I do love me some Cronenberg. I do think Dead Ringers or Videodrome are his best efforts. They're just a little too good for this list. I'm trying to look at movies where the primary emotion I have when thinking back at them is a pit in my stomach and not, Jesus, that was awesome. So I'm picking The Fly. The story fits on a cocktail napkin. Jeff Goldblum invents teleporter, teleports with Fly, splices DNA, turns into Fly, done. But the meat of the story is the slow transformation through several stages into the Fly-human hybrid monster, not only physically but also psychologically. Of course, Cronenberg's practical effects are pretty much unsurpassed, but Jeff Goldblum's slow internal transformation makes you queasy because it attacks something deep down at the base of your humanity. It's the story of someone inflicted with essentially a parasite, due to little or no fault of their own, that takes over his body from the inside, turning him upside down and inside out until there's nothing left of the original man. By the time Goldblum realizes the transformation continues and he stops being fascinated and tries to find a way out, it's too late. People at the time were quick to point out that the whole thing works as a metaphor for AIDS, while Cronenberg said he was more thinking disease in general, like cancer, which is exactly what you're witnessing here. And again, the actual body horror effects, at the physical side of things, do their darndest to hammer the point home. I'm not faint of heart when it comes to creature effects and whatnot, but Jeff Goldblum pulling out a tooth in front of the mirror is an image I'll never be able to delete again. For the next two entries, I want to go overseas and talk about some disturbing efforts from East Asia, namely Korea and Japan. Korea has been reliably pumping out some of the highest quality horror and most inventively disturbing movies for a couple of decades now. Most of them fall somewhere on the horror arthouse spectrum, and none of them shy away from drastic images and ideas. On the artsier side, I recommend movies by Kim Ki-duk like Möbius and Pieta, straightforwardly plunging you into disturbing scenarios. Not all of which seem natural or realistic, but they are always presented in a very poetic language. I particularly remember 3 Iron, the Korean title of which translates into Empty Houses, which is a way better title in my opinion. With almost no dialogue spoken, we follow around essentially squatters and get to see their melancholy and longing, but also the domestic violence and social disparity all around them. But I'm getting off track. We want to talk less about poetry and more balls to the wall anguish and scarring K-horror. A very basic approach to that is I Saw the Devil, which, though it has its very simple premise, manages to awesomely execute it and all intercut with explosions of violence. And then there's the movies by Park Chan-wook. I particularly want to highlight Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance and Lady Vengeance for an unflinching look at revenge taken on a child killer by the kid's parents. There's generally a theme in this type of movies. We are taken into a twilight world that exists under the Korean society where people live in poverty and outcasts and human monsters are all over the place. And nowhere is that more apparent than in Old Boy. Without any rhyme or reason, a man is kidnapped and incarcerated for years, only to be released back into the world without a warning. As these movies go, especially if they know what they're doing, you're essentially feeling the captivity with the guy. You watch him go up the walls, see his mental health deteriorate, all while you can pretty much smell the stale air inside the apartment. The second part deals with the man tracking down his kidnappers and finding answers as to the why of what happened to him, which treats us to a disturbing net of decaying Korean cityscapes, more explosive violence, double incest, and some claw hammer on teeth action, which I didn't necessarily need to see, The violence and the sex and the horrible imagery I wouldn't call gratuitous though. It serves a purpose, and that is to transport you into this world that most people have never seen and hopefully won't ever get to be a part of. Most of what you're shown or subjected to is heightened and stylized, which doesn't mean that it's an easy task to keep your distance. Yes, a lot of it is poetic, but it's belched right in your face. The granddaddy of disturbing Asian movie factories is Japan. They definitely know how to get under your skin. And I'm not even talking about the standard J-horror like The Ring or The Grudge. I'm also not talking about the movies that fall squarely into the art house realm like Onibaba or Tetsuo the Iron Man from earlier. Or really sick shit like Naked Blood or Men Behind the Sun, which I know was made in Hong Kong, but it does deal with Japanese war crimes, so I would like to give a recommendation though for Belladonna of Sadness, which is hauntingly beautiful in an existentially dreadful kind of way. But once more, I'm talking about stuff that leaves a really bitter taste in your mouth days after you're done watching. And who better to highlight here than Takashi Miike? I recommend the nightmarish corpse hunt of Gozu, as well as the deeply unsettling family sex comedy drama, and there's a bunch of words I never thought I would say, of Visitor Q. But if there's any one movie that showcases J-horror's ability to reach deep into your stomach and leave a bag of pits, it's Audition. The first half watches more or less like a run-of-the-mill romance/drama, and that's why the second half manages to hit you even harder. A TV executive sets up a casting for a fake dating show to find a potential new wife. He picks that girl Asami, who at first glance seems like a regular girl, but as the story progresses, it's revealed that through scenes sticking out like sore thumbs, disgusting scenes and disgustingly brilliant scenes, what a sick monster she is. And not to spoil anything, but the bag scene is pretty damn unnerving. We're not exactly sure what she's capable of through most of the movie, but the tension has us on the edge of our seats as we follow the TV producer investigate her and find himself in the twilight world of Tokyo's underbelly. At the end of this tense 90-minute ride, the story unloads itself into the most horrific 15 minutes of girl-on-man action that I've ever seen. You know right away when you see her black apron that she's ready to do some meat work, and you get to watch all of it. It's not so much the horrific stuff the guy is exposed to at the end, that's special effects and the fake blood is gonna come right off. It's the build-up and growing dread for what's to come that gets under your skin and makes you gasp for air as you drown in the neon-lit back alleys, trying to find out what's going to happen. It's one thing to look at people living on the fringe, it's another thing to do it with an unflinching eye and complete detachment and no emotion. Next, I want to talk about portrait movies of the bottom ground of society, living in filth right down there where the monsters hang out. These films don't try to rationalize or motivate the mayhem brought on. They don't try to make you sympathize, nor do they pass judgment. You're shown the cold, hard, detached reality of some of the worst of the worst. These are movies like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, and the lesser-known Austrian movie Angst, which essentially hits the same beats and the same mood. You don't just watch serial killers with no remorse or explanation, but you have a foul taste in your mouth for days after. I also, let's say, recommend the German movie The Golden Glove, about a real-life German serial killer who was hunting in a world of prostitutes, alcohol-induced delirium tremens, and human driftwood. But the serial killer movie I always come back to in terms of making me feel bad for days afterwards is Monster. The movie is based on the real-life murders of Eileen Wuornos. Coming from a more than screwed up background, Eileen lived in Florida, where she earned a living as a street prostitute facing drugs, brutal rape, poverty, and all sorts of other horrors until she eventually starts murdering some of her Johns. There's a lot to be read into this. It's retaliation of the tortured individual against her tormentors. The story is a cry for better mental health care and an indictment against the social safety net that lets too many people slip through the cracks. It's the question of how we treat the weakest in society and how we let a system continue that breeds catastrophes like this one. Though there's a lot of horrific scenes in this movie and a lot of great acting by Charlize Theron, one scene in particular burned itself into my eyeballs, and it's symbolic of the life too many people in this country are subjected to. Early on in the movie, Eileen, who is essentially homeless or lives out of a car or whatever, cleans herself up. She doesn't have access to a shower or a proper bathroom, the bare human necessities, so she strips down to her stained, wall-marked underwear in a gas station bathroom and washes herself with wet wipes in front of the little metal mirror that's bolted to the wall. There's not a lot of physical disgust for me coming directly from what is shown, but the implication the image carries for the situation of the people in the movie, as well as people who face this as a reality on a daily basis, made Monster in general, and the bathroom scene in particular, one of my routine answers to what movie disturbed you the most. This is probably the only movie I literally had to take a shower after, and not to sound elitist, with water. Let's talk about cartoons for a minute. For a lot of us, these are the first movies we ever watch. More often than not, they are formative experiences. They leave an impression on us and help us tell apart what we like and what we will like in the future. And a whole bunch of them will leave some nasty scars, because there's some naughty animated stuff out there. But we're magically drawn to this sort of movie. We keep watching when we do better to switch them off. There's an aura of doing something forbidden that pulls us in and keeps our eyes glued to the TV. When we watch those cartoons that made it into the afternoon program that clearly shouldn't be there. There's the classic British cartoons that messed up generations of kids, like Watership Down and The Plague Dogs, and the slow nuclear horror that is When the Wind Blows. While being comparatively tame in the visuals, and I said comparatively, the subject matter is completely overwhelming for anyone underage, and most people above too. And they're managing to sneak up on you. You're used to happy, frolicking cartoons where the worst thing that happens is Bambi's mom getting killed off screen with a shot to the face, and that subversion of expectation helps you cut deeper than any cannibal movie ever could. Oh, and I forgot about Animal Farm. Oh god, the horse. Remember the horse? I also want to give a shout out to some cartoons that were clearly made for exclusively older audiences, still managing to leave us shaken afterwards. I'm thinking Heavy Metal, or Fritz the Cat, with its depiction of drug use, full frontal nudity, sexual assault, racism, and a bunch of Nazi animals. And don't forget about all the anime that's a little less family friendly than Pokemon. What about Ninja Scroll, which is actually a great movie in itself, but I don't know how I feel about the, rock monster finger rape. I'm just calling it what it is. I also want to point out I hate Grave of the Fireflies with a burning passion, but that's a different video. I'll give this slot to the one movie that burned itself into my mind when I was way too young. Let's briefly talk about Felidae. At first glance, it's a cute cat solves neighborhood mystery flick, animated Don Bluth style, but after about the 10-minute mark, shit goes south. We're confronted with decidedly less whimsical adventures. Pregnant cats getting murdered with their insides scattered around, rape, incest, a doomsday cult comprised of masochistic cat fanatics. Oh, and illegal animal experimentation, which is crucial to the plot, but only ranges somewhere in the middle of the let's scar some kids scale. And then halfway through, we got a dream or nightmare sequence from hell. Think, or don't, demon Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, playing string puppets with decaying cat corpses. At the end, they reveal a convoluted plot about cat eugenics, but at that point you're so exhausted it doesn't really matter anymore. It's not a horribly great movie, so the ugh definitely outweighs any redeeming qualities. Also, I want to point out that the guy that originally wrote the story came out as a crazy Nazi apologist years later, which adds a whole different layer of disgusting to the whole thing. This slot is dedicated to movies that left me completely exhausted by the end. These are the movies that have you vicariously live through the protagonist like uncut gems. Every time Adam Sandler makes the obviously wrong decision and takes a turn for the worse, has you clasp your seat and yell at the screen until you're just a puddle at the end. Or what about the movies that exhaust you due to the subject matter? There's the Russian World War II drama Come and See that takes you by the hand and unflinchingly shows you the horrors Belarusian partisans experienced during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Also the movie The Downfall, which fits snugly in between those two categories. You're witnessing some of the most horrible people in history living their final days, while at the same time you feel like you're breathing the stale bunker air with them until you have a headache. But the master of getting you winded without having to get up from your seat is Gaspar Noé. He doesn't just like to hold you in a headlock and force you to keep watching. Below the grossness there's always an existential horror lurking that unsettles and keeps your mind busy for days afterwards too. Anybody seen Climax and its gorgeously choreographed dance scenes that slowly turn into a train wreck of human shittiness? There's Love, more than 2 hours of watching two people slowly fall out of love, suffering through their deteriorating relationship, only interrupted by full-on unsimulated sex scenes that go on for way too long to be sexy or even comfortable. It's hard not to carry a heavy pit in your stomach after this, but it's ultimately a rewarding experience. A meditation on what humans do to each other and how good intentions can go south real quick. And it's in 3D. To have a less rewarding experience, I suggest Irreversible. It's magnum opus in terms of making people feel sick to their stomachs. The plot doesn't really matter or is horribly interesting. It's essentially a revenge rape story told in reverse chronological order, with some other stuff strung into it. When talking about Irreversible, most people immediately jump to the fact that there's a 12-minute long scene in which Monica Bellucci gets raped, and you can't see my air quotes, to watch all of it. It's harrowing and disturbing, even by Noé's standards. There's a certain aesthetic to the whole ordeal, which definitely jives with the new French extremity movement, but if this was all there was to this movie, I wouldn't mention it here. The truly nauseating and exhausting thing about this movie is the camera work. Especially in the first third, we are constantly exposed to jerky movement, harsh cuts, omnipresent strobe lights. It's a roller coaster ride that only stops to have you witness a cavalcade of gore and rape. And then it's right back on track. I also want to point out that the audio deliberately has some low-frequency sounds mixed into it in an effort to induce anxiety and nausea in the viewer. Be that as it may, your home cinema speakers are most likely not able to reproduce this effect. There's also tie-ins to two other movies Noé made, forming the so-called Horse Butcher trilogy, which is actually quite interesting, but that's not why we're doing this list. Alright, so we already talked about cartoons that left us with scars, but there's one more kiddie-looking movie I want to mention. Meet the Feebles. Before making all the fantasy movies in the world, Peter Jackson's specialty were weird, offbeat schlockfests that had all a similar flavor of gross-out gore mixed with dark humor. There's 1987's Bad Taste, about alien invaders snatching up humans for an intergalactic McDonald's, as well as 1992's Brain Dead, marketed as Dead Alive in North America, which saw both a kung fu fighting one-liner spitting priest and what can be called the best lawnmower-based death scene in a movie without hyperbole. Meet the Feebles dials back the gore, and the humor is a lot less playful and far more mean-spirited. The whole movie is comprised of little vignettes showing the behind-the-scenes lives of some goofy-looking puppets that make their money putting on a Muppet Show-style variety program. Some of the puppets are in adulterous relationships with each other, have legitimate children, and suffer through the ups and downs of stardom. There's sexual harassment and assault. Some of the puppets are addicted to heroin and have Deer Hunter-style Vietnam flashbacks. There's an underground porno and forced prostitution ring run by a cockroach that some of the puppets get coaxed into. Oh, and then there's a rabbit who has what I'm guessing to be rabbit AIDS. At the end, the hippo goes insane, shoots up the place, and massacres most of the other puppets. The only real source of humor comes from the fact that all the characters are whimsically looking puppets that do decidedly non-puppet things. The entire atmosphere is incredibly bleak and even more sleazy than any of Jackson's other films at the time. This is even further exacerbated by the gross-out special effects, flinging around pus, puke, and any other bodily fluid. That being said, once you start, you can't look away from the mayhem on the screen. Every new story thread has a turn for the worse that makes you groan even louder. And you're sort of curious what Jackson's gonna do next to outdo his last disgusting climax. None of the characters in this are endearing, every horrible deed the puppets do to each other is amped up from real life, and the grimy behind the scenes of the feeble variety hour is a headache-inducing nightmare at best. And that's pretty much the point. The anxiety-overcharged atmosphere stays with you long after the movie is over, much longer than you remember any of the specific characters, and you can never unfeel any of this. Plus there's a puppet called the Masked Masochist, so that too. We talked about adults living on the fringe of society, so now it's only fair to talk about the kids whose life gave us crippling depression as well. This is coming towards the end of the list since everything is exponentially worse if it happens to kids. They have their lives ahead of themselves, they're supposed to be pure, innocent, and then shit hits the fan and gut punch to the audience is all the worse. I'm not gonna beat around the bush for long, I just want to mention Harmony Korine's, well, everything, but especially Gummo. The surreal atmosphere alone is stomach churning. Also quick, not entirely serious mention of Patty McCormack as Rhoda Penmark in The Bad Seed, which inexplicably creeps me out. There's just something really unnerving about a bossy little girl that murders people for their shoes. Additionally, the OG pedophile story Lolita, and don't watch Kubrick's version, it's a horrible movie by any standard, and fight me on this, maybe I'll make a video about this too. The arguably better version of the story is the Jeremy Irons Lolita from the 1990s, but that comes with its own bag of unpleasantness. The number one pick for unsettling movies that involve kids is Larry Clark's aptly titled movie, Kids. On the surface, it's a simple story. Some kids in New York City are living the day seemingly without any parental supervision, instead of the usual shenanigans that this would lead to in an ordinary movie. These kids, namely two teenage boys named Casper and Tally, are constantly looking for drugs and sex, and the latter of the two by any means necessary. Tally doesn't get tired of letting his buddy know that he's particularly into virgins, which is disgusting in its own right, but it gets worse when we find out that he's HIV positive and does not care who he spreads it to. We follow around one of his victims in her effort to prevent Tally from infecting more girls, only to get roofied and raped by Casper at the end. All the while, Tally rapes another girl, probably infecting her too. Spoiler alert, everybody's got AIDS at the end. It's essentially nihilism the movie. Some of the kids in question have no moral compass and nobody cares what they do until it's too late. We are presented with the same underlying nauseating situation we already encountered with Eileen Wuornos in Monster. You squirm in your seat as you want to get into the movie and shake all the participants and get some common sense and decency into them, but you can't. There's no compensating justice, nobody to help out these kids as they slide down a horrible path, symbolic of the fate that thousands of people had and have to endure. That's at least how I watched it. Of course, there's an unpleasant voyeuristic component to Kids. We sit and keep watching and get up and forget about it, passively consuming till we're just as exhausted by the end as the characters and ask ourselves, Jesus Christ, what happened? I talked at length about rape, murder, incest, pedophiles, the fringes of society. For my number 2 slot, I want to briefly talk about another layer of existential horror, when people can't behave themselves. And hear me out on this one. Take for example Darren Aronofsky's Mother. Once you get past the aggressively self-indulgent religious allegory, you're left with a sort of home invasion story that makes my toenails curl up. Isn't that everybody's worst nightmare? People defying all social conventions and not leaving your home, your sacred space that nobody should have a right to invade unless specifically asked to. Jennifer Lawrence keeps asking Ed Harris and Michelle Pfeiffer to leave and it has no effect. Even worse, Javier Bardem encourages them to stay and willfully ignores her very clear wishes. This goes against all social conditioning we might have. The rules and traditions that implicitly steer social interactions are out of the window, and we are left not being able to retaliate, since, even though we are clearly wronged, our politeness prevents us to scoop to the level of the invaders. But it can always be worse. Where Mother stopped and ducked away, Michael Haneke's Funny Games took over and dialed it up to 11, and it's therefore my number 2 pick of the movies that made me oh so uncomfortable. Note that there's a shot-for-shot American remake by Haneke himself, which, who cares? Funny Games has a somewhat similar premise as Mother. 2 psychopaths invade the life of a well-adjusted family and turn it into a nightmare. They skillfully find every social taboo that we agreed on and meticulously break it into pieces. There's a ton of unpleasant to watch physical violence in the movie, but that takes a complete backseat against the emotional and psychological violence exerted. We vicariously suffer through and along with the family held hostage in their own home, while the relentless psychopaths holding them keep grinding them down, and by extension us with them. There's no rhyme or reason why any of this happens, making the whole ordeal even worse. Funny Games still makes me shudder just thinking of it. As a little PS, I also want to recommend and highlight another Haneke film called The Piano Teacher, based on a book by Nobel laureate Elfriede Jelinek. While Funny Games was showing people incarcerated and tortured by outside forces, the titular piano teacher is a psychologically unstable woman completely immobilized by her own neuroses, complexes, sexual frustrations, as well as her overbearing mother, who micromanages her day-to-day life. I strongly recommend this one, and not just for the scene where she sniffs jizzy Kleenex at a porno theater. Alright, this is the last one and I'm sort of cheating here. Picking a disturbing documentary is easy. Documentaries, most of the time, tell true stories, and what's more disturbing than what we do to each other on a daily basis? They get under your skin real quick because what you see is real people, and all of a sudden the screen becomes a two-way street. I recommend Capturing the Friedmans, about some really heinous child abusers hiding amongst everybody's neighbors. 3 identical strangers about a heartwarming coincidence turning real bleak real quick. And of course Jesus Camp, as if you need another good reason to be wary of religious fundamentalism. Oh, and Horse Glory for a look into the lives of prostitutes in Thailand, Bangladesh and Mexico and the conditions they have to live in. But for my number 1 pick, I'll go one step further. The Austrian documentary Im Keller, In the Basement, does not only show the mundane horror lurking in your neighbor's basement, it does it in a style that can only be described as meditative masochism. Unsettling long takes, still lifes and tableaus, all engineered to make you squirm in your seat. They don't cut away and you can't look anywhere else. Im Keller has a deceivingly simple premise. We're given glimpses into the hobbies, quirks and passions that everyday people live out in their finished basements. We see the usual laundry rooms, exercise bikes, exotic pets you probably shouldn't have. We see a retired hunter showing off more taxidermy than most museums have. There's the old couple with a party basement that has been empty for years, high-tech speakers blasting polka music for nobody. It's starting to get really unsettling. There's a guy who turned his basement into a shooting range, casually conversing with his buddies how immigrants are ruining the country. There's an array of sex dungeons, as one would expect when talking about basement obsessions, but all their owners are presenting and talking about their seedy little S&M studios as intentionally listlessly as you would read out a dishwasher manual. And finally, when you think you've been through the worst, you meet the old guy who holds binge drinking events in a basement with enough Nazi memorabilia to put any World War II movie set to shame. It's not just what is shown, and believe me, director Ulrich Seidel shows plenty. It's also the monotonous, meditative way, passionlessly reporting the mundanity of stuff most people wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Everybody staring right into the camera, right at the viewer, that makes this the most unsettling thing I've ever seen. Well, there you go. Stuff that disgusts me, disturbs me, and unsettles me. If nothing else, I hope it gave you some ideas what to not watch next. Let me know in the comments what movies got under your skin, and I'll let you know what they did for me.